Hey everyone, how you feeling? It's Jason George.
And Todd Grinnell.
Now, I'm gonna take a wild guess that at some point in the past few years, you've been part of a heavy or challenging or even exhausting conversation about, say it with me now,
Racism.
It could have been online or at a family gathering or in a class or a work thing or maybe even just in your own head. But at some point, someone eventually brings up the term systemic racism. And then you ask yourself the question,
What exactly is systemic racism anyway?
and does it even still exist?
Oh, I know the answer to this one.
Yeah.
It does. All right, this was fun. See ya.
Okay. Systemic racism is the idea that some of our country's policies and practices were set up to benefit certain groups and harm others. But a lot of people might assume that kind of racism is a relic of our past.
I mean, how can the system be rigged like that when we've got Beyonce?
Who doesn't love Beyonce?
I love Beyonce.
It's Beyonce, Queen Bee. It's the 2020s. We've had black folks reach the highest levels of power in Washington. Celebrated black athletes and entertainers are everywhere you look. Look, we have black billionaires. I mean, how could that level of black excellence exist if racism is still baked into our laws and institutions?
Well, why don't we take a few minutes with no blame and no shame to have a deeper conversation about it? Because when there's a system in place designed to bring some of us down, it's actually really bad for all of us. So, is systemic racism still a thing?
Okay, so I think that to properly answer that question, we have to go all the way back to the Civil War.
Oh, you mean that war that was fought over how government was going to run, the freedoms, and what people could and couldn't do?
And you've probably also heard that the Civil War was all about states' rights. Yeah, it was the states' rights to allow slavery. And do you know how we know that? Show me receipts.
Here we go. Got a history book right here. Because the leaders of the Confederacy were literally saying it out loud. Here we go. Here's a quote from the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. "The Negro is not equal to the white man. Slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Our new government, the Confederacy, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Well, that seems pretty clear.
Oh yeah, it's crystal clear. But let's get extra real. The Confederates weren't oppressing, terrorizing, beating, murdering, and enslaving human beings just because of the color of their skin. This was also about
Money.
You follow me?
Indeed I do.
Yeah. Basically, slavery was the economic engine of the South, the backbone of America's agricultural industry. By the start of the war in 1861, the South was producing 75% of the world's cotton, run pretty much completely on the labor of enslaved human beings. And this made the enslavers rich as fuck. That. The Mississippi River Valley, where most of the cotton was grown, had more millionaires per capita than literally anywhere else in the United States.
So when the Confederates lost the Civil War in 1865, those plantation owners were extremely unhappy about losing the enslaved human beings they were forcing to pick their cotton for free.
All of a sudden, 4 million people held against their will for generations in the South were emancipated. Within just a few years, black men would gain the right to vote and even hold elected office in Congress. Black people started building their own farms, their own towns, their own economic and political power. But that never really stopped the racist insurrectionists of the Confederacy. Instead of accepting that they lost the war and joining the efforts to unite and rebuild the South,
They immediately started passing black codes, or Jim Crow laws, designed to restrict where and when black people could work and live and travel and eat and drink and swim. As you might imagine, these laws made sure more black people were arrested and put in jail. But they also made sure that black people were paid less, denied their constitutional right to vote, and even allowed formerly enslaved children to be seized for forced labor.
And these pissed off Confederates, who again actually lost the war, didn't just pass laws to oppress black Americans. Nah, they did a lot more than that. A whole bunch of them actually organized themselves, donned white hoods, and got violent. Violence against black Americans, including lynchings, became commonplace.
And this went on for literally 100 years.
Yeah, that's right. It took a full century for the good people of conscience who marched, fought, and risked their lives to get these racist laws overturned. Finally, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Jim Crow was legally put to an end. So that was, what, about 60 years ago? I need you to think about that. When your mom or grandma were kids, Jim Crow was still a thing.
But once those laws were overturned, that was the end of systemic racism, right?
Sure, sure. No.
Look, this history is painful, but we can't be afraid to face it. Pretending it didn't happen just keeps it going. Facing it is how we change it. So let's take a look at the legacy of Jim Crow 60 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Now remember how Jim Crow laws made sure black folks were paid less? Well, today, for every dollar white folks earn, black people earn about 56 cents.
Which is insane. And how Jim Crow laws prevented black people from holding certain jobs? Well, for the past 60 years, black unemployment has been consistently twice that of white people.
Twice. And remember when Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation in schools? Well, today, segregation is actually getting worse, which matters because schools attended by mostly people of color are often chronically underfunded.
And what about those century-old redlining restrictions where banks would refuse to grant mortgages in black neighborhoods? Black families ended up being denied the chance to build the generational wealth that comes with owning a home. So it's hardly a coincidence that today just 42% of African Americans own homes, compared to 72% of whites.
And don't even get me started on our healthcare system, where black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth.
But even with all those examples, you still may be asking yourself why. If systemic racism still exists, who's responsible?
And we might answer that question by asking, who benefits? Well, certain billionaire CEOs, for example, might have a vested interest in keeping us at each other's throats versus being able to unionize across racial lines, to raise wages and working standards.
Same thing in politics. If a certain party or candidate is known to receive most of their support from white voters, they might believe they can stay in power if fewer people of color are able to vote.
So as long as this type of injustice is allowed to go on, we know that black people as a group lose. But maybe the most difficult and painful question we can honestly ask at this point is, do white people as a group win?
That's a great question. Some white folks think that if people of color are given a bigger piece of the pie, that means less pie for them, but that's just not true.
Yeah, in reality, success doesn't look like that. The truth is that in a healthy community, when one of us thrives, we all thrive.
Yeah, when affirmative action was passed back in the 1960s, it helped around 5 million members of minority groups move up in the workplace. But it also did the same thing for about 6 million women, the majority of whom were white. So affirmative action helped us all. But when laws are passed to push a particular group of people down, those policies almost always undermine the civil rights of other groups too.
For instance, since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, nearly 100 new restrictive voting laws have been passed in states that, not coincidentally, share a history of discrimination against black people.
And no surprise, these laws, making it harder to vote early or vote by mail, have ended up suppressing not just black votes, but votes from working class people of all ethnicities, including white people.
Yeah, look, at this point, I hope we can all agree that a system tainted by systemic racism hurts us all.
So let's be honest about the fact that the history of our country was marked indelibly by systemic racism, and that the legacy of that racism is still with us today.
Because when we're brave enough to stand strong in that honesty together, a new way forward is truly possible, where all the ones we love are safe and prosperous and joyful. And if you made it this far, we want to thank you for showing up today. Change starts right here, making our way through difficult conversations with facts, civility,
A little humor.
just a little bit of humor, and a lot of love. We'll see you next time. There you go.
We did it.
Buddy cop movie. Buddy cop movie.